Welcome to part 6 of our lecture series on chapter 3, Biology and Behavior. So now we've talked about the limbic system. Let's talk about the cerebral cortex. So the cerebral cortex is what you can actually see if you're holding a human brain. So we're going to talk about all that wrinkly stuff. We're going to talk about the different lobes on the cerebral cortex, and we're going to talk about the various cortexes on each lobe of the brain. So let's start with the frontal lobe. The frontal lobe is all of this right here. It ends here at the blue and goes all the way to the forehead. So each of the lobes in the cerebral cortex play specific roles. They have very specific jobs, but they have to work together so that you have a cohesive human experience. The frontal lobe is the lobe that is responsible for planning, for movement, and for higher executive functioning. So examples of higher executive functioning are self-awareness, initiative, the ability to initiate behaviors, voluntary motion, planning, responsibility, emotion. It's also responsible for our understanding of rewards and consequences. The frontal lobe also integrates info from other parts of the brain. It's the puzzle solver. And I talked about how the parts of the limbic system have to send information to the frontal lobe so that the puzzle of a memory can be solved. So we've got the frontal lobe right here. Let's look at the parietal lobe. Parietal lobe is this area right here. Sorry about that. So the parietal lobe is responsible for sensation. The parietal lobe is especially critical to your understanding of touch, to the sensory information you get through your skin. So is something touching your skin? How much pressure is it putting on? What's the temperature? Are you comfortable in the room that you're in? It's also sending information from your body's muscles and joints. So we've got the parietal lobe right here. And then we get the temporal lobe. The temporal lobe is this lobe right here. So the temporal lobe is critical for hearing and speech. In order to be able to speak, to understand what's being said, your temporal lobe has to be working properly. Now there's what's called Wernicke's area and Broca's area. Wernicke's area is critical for speech comprehension. I believe here we've got Wernicke's area, and it's on the left temporal lobe. It is only on the left temporal lobe. So, in order for you to understand what someone is saying to you, in order for you to understand the words that I'm saying and the sentences that I'm saying, your left temporal lobe is critical, specifically Wernicke's area. If you have a stroke, so let's imagine that this stroke was in Wernicke's area. Your ability to understand what is being said is critically injured. This lecture would just sound like gibberish. I know, you're like, it already sounds like gibberish, but it would sound so much more like gibberish. Now, Broca's area is involved with speech production, my ability to say words and sentences. Now, this is in the left frontal lobe. But both Wernicke's area and Broca's area are critical for speech. So Wernicke's area is speech comprehension, and that is in the left temporal lobe. And Broca's area is in the left frontal lobe. So here we see a brain in which this patient had a stroke in Broca's area. And that meant that that person was no longer able to produce speech. And something we will find with stroke victims is that if their speech areas are injured, so if it's Broca's area that is injured, that patient is still trying to speak. What we hear is complete gibberish, but in their head, what they're saying makes complete sense. And so they don't understand why no one understands what they're saying. If Wernicke's area is damaged, that patient hears other people's speech as gibberish, can't understand anything that other people are saying to them, but they can still produce speech. Damage to these areas is incredibly frustrating for stroke patients because we're so dependent on speech for communication. So here we've got Broca's area on the left frontal lobe and Wernicke's area on the left temporal lobe. Now the temporal lobe, let's see, so this area right here, this is a region on the cerebral cortex, below the parietal lobe and in front of the occipital lobe. So we have parietal right here, we have occipital right here. It is important for processing auditory information, for memory, but also for your ability to recognize objects and to perceive faces. There's a great book by Oliver Sacks called The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat. And Sacks worked with very unusual neurological cases. And so something was wrong with this gentleman's brain because when he looked at faces, he saw hats. Weird. Fascinating. I really recommend the book. Anything by Oliver Sacks is good. Now, on the temporal lobe, you have the fusiform face area. And this part of the temporal lobe is more active when we're looking at faces versus looking at other objects. So here we have the fusiform gyrus, the fusiform facial area. And it's on the underside of both temporal lobes. You have a right temporal lobe and a left temporal lobe. And these areas of the brain show increased activity when you're looking at faces versus looking at other objects. And then we get to the occipital lobe, and this is responsible for vision. Your primary visual pathway is in the occipital lobe. Now, for some odd reason, the occipital lobe is at the back of the brain, and your eyes are at the front of your head. I don't understand how evolution shaped us to have our visual pathway, primary visual pathway, at the back of the head versus the front of the head, but it did. So this is our primary visual pathway. Now, in order for us to see, information comes from the receptor sites in the eye, and it goes through what's called the optic nerve. So each eye connects to the optic nerve, sends that information to the thalamus, which then sends that information to the occipital lobe. The occipital lobe is very long. Interestingly, we all have little blind spots. And in each eye, at the back of each eye, The blind spot is where the occipital lobe begins. Sorry, the blind spot is where the occipital nerve begins. So actually, if you just have one eye, you're going to have a little blind area, but your brain fills in the information. It's fascinating. When you've got two eyes, your brain fills in, each eye fills in the missing information from the other eye. Then we get to the primary somatosensory cortex and the primary motor cortex. So, let me just check something. So now we've looked at the four lobes. We've looked at the frontal lobe, parietal lobe, occipital lobe, and temporal lobe. Now I want to look at cortexes. A cortex is a specialized area on each lobe that is fine-tuned for certain human behaviors, emotions, and motivations. So we have what's called the primary somatosensory cortex, which processes sensory information. Now this is on the this should say, please correct this, this should say parietal lobe. So sorry about that. Replace temporal lobe with parietal lobe. So the primary somatosensory cortex processes sensory information. It's on the parietal lobe because that's where the brain processes somatosensory information. The primary motor cortex processes movement, and that's on the frontal lobe. So here we see we've got our parietal lobe right here with the primary somatosensory cortex. And here we've got our frontal lobe with our primary motor cortex. Now there's something called the somatosensory and motor homunculus. And this is one of the reasons the two cortexes are against each other, because sensation and movement are correlated. Whenever you have a sensory experience, it often results in some kind of movement. So on each of these cortexes, you'll see that the amount of tissue dedicated to a specific area of the body, the areas that engage in the most movement on the motor cortex have the most tissue dedicated to that part of the body. So our knee pretty much just goes back and forth. It's a basic, simple movement. The knee does not need much tissue on the motor cortex. However, our faces move constantly. So as you can see, the human face has a tremendous amount of motor cortex tissue dedicated to it, as do the hands, because we move our hands all the time and we have very fine motor skills. This same process goes on with the somatosensory cortex. The more sensitive a body part, the more tissue on the somatosensory cortex is dedicated to that part of the body. Our faces and our hands are the two most sensitive parts of the body. Your lips are incredibly sensitive. There's a lot of nerve endings in the lips. The thumb and the fingers have a tremendous number of nerve endings. So it makes sense that such a large amount of neurological tissue is dedicated to the face and hands on the somatosensory cortex. Let me check my next slide. Okay, so an artist did two sculptures based on what the human body would look like if the human body matched the motor cortex and the somatosensory cortex. These are kind of weird, but I think they do a great job of showing us the homunculus. So this is what the body would look like if the distribution of tissue in the motor cortex matched the size of the organ. So this is your motor homunculus. As you can see, your knees are teeny tiny. Your lips and mouth are huge. Not much on your forehead because there's not a whole lot of movement you can do in your forehead, but your hands and your general face area are enormous. And this is our sensory homunculus. As you can see, again, the face and hands are enormous because they're incredibly sensitive to sensory information. Your ears are pretty large too. These are so creepy, but I think they're great for illustrating the homunculus. And then we get to the corpus callosum. The corpus callosum is a pathway that allows both hemispheres of the brain to communicate with each other. So, as I have discussed, we have two brains, basically. We have the right hemisphere and the left hemisphere. These two hemispheres need the corpus callosum to transmit information from one hemisphere to the other. This is the part of the brain that joins the two hemispheres together. So the right, as we talked about when we were talking about the brainstem, we know that the right brain controls the right brain controls the left side of the body, and the left brain controls the right side of the body. So this is where the left hemisphere sends information to the right side of the body, and the right hemisphere sends information to the left side of the body. So we have the corpus callosum right here. It's a very dense organ. Let me check my next slide. And here you see if we had removed part of the right hemisphere, this shows you how the corpus callosum joins both hemispheres of the brain. Now here's something that's really fascinating. This is very rare, but it is a surgery that is sometimes necessary. For people with very severe seizure disorders, they're having dozens of seizures a day, and these seizures have the potential to be life-threatening. One of the ways they stop those seizures is by severing the corpus callosum. Then the seizure cannot jump to the opposite hemisphere. So if your seizure disorder if the seizures originate in the left hemisphere, by severing the corpus callosum, we protect the right hemisphere. And this saves lives when you can block the seizure from jumping hemispheres. It protects the brain so that people can have a more normal life. Sometimes they'll sever the corpus callosum and remove one of the hemispheres of the brain. This is quite drastic. A couple of years ago, there was a little boy in North Bend, Oregon, who had a hemispherectomy because of his seizure disorder. He was a toddler. For that surgery, they severed the corpus callosum and they removed one of his hemispheres. So if his seizures were originating in the left hemisphere, they severed the corpus callosum and removed the entire left hemisphere. What is amazing is that the brain learns to compensate. All of a sudden, the right hemisphere is going to take over and is going to start being responsible for what the left hemisphere was also responsible for. Now, this takes time. You know, it's not immediate. It takes time, it takes occupational therapy, physical therapy. But for this little guy, he had to have that surgery to save his life. Okay, so we are at the end of part 6 of our lecture series on Chapter 3, Biology and Behavior.